With this movie, I expect that we'll finish up our handout 1.02. We'll talk right now about sequences, but what I should mention straight off the bat is that um, sequences can be difficult to talk about. They take some time to become familiar with. On the annotated version of the handout, I've given you a couple of examples of sequences in music in the Burckhardt Anthology, and I really urge you to study these. Now, I won't have a direct question about sequence on the midterm or the final, but I include this information because it can only help you in your analysis of music and, again, in your appreciation of music. So if this isn't crystal clear to you, don't worry about it. Don't worry. Try to get what you can from it, and we will try to elucidate things along the way. What I'd like to do is to begin with a word from Carl Schachter and Edward Aldwell, the co-authors of the very influential music theory textbook Harmony and Voice Leading. Let me just read this for you, this excerpt here. I think it's exceedingly good. Here's Aldwell and Schachter. A crucial element, often indeed the crucial element in musical design and form, is repetition of a melodic or chordal pattern. If such repetitions occur on different scale degrees, the result is called a sequence. Maintaining the same musical idea, sometimes with slight variations, establishes a connection between the beginning and the end of the sequential passage and creates the possibility for expansions, some on quite a large scale, of the techniques we have already discussed. So when you boil down what Aldwell and Schachter have said here, it seems that sequence entails the repetition of a similar melodic and chordal pattern at a different pitch level. Sequences, for Stephen E. Lates, represent something of a paradox. There seems to be a lot of activity on the musical surface, lots of chord changes, lots of motion, but relatively little activity beneath the surface. Sequences can sometimes be used within a prolongation of tonic. Sometimes sequences can be used to move away from tonic. Sequences, furthermore, operate in their own little world. The normal rules of harmonic progression and even some rules of voice leading may not apply. So in typical harmonic progression, 2 resolves to 5. Usually, for instance, the leading tone resolves to 1. But in sequences where the rules of normal harmonic motion need not apply, 2 may move to 6. The leading tone triad may move to a median triad. Don't be confused by this. As for voice leading within a sequence, you may find unusual doublings, such as a double leading tone, whereas other voice leading rules still apply. You won't find parallel fifths or parallel octaves, that sort of thing. And a sequential passage, once begun, can end at any time. Such a passage needn't be followed all the way through. We can speak about the parts of a sequence using these terms. We can speak about, to begin with, the model. The model is the melodic and harmonic idea that serves as the structural design. The copy or sequence refers to the passages that follow the model. I've given you the Latin verb for to follow, and you see how our English word sequence is buried right in that Latin word. As for our kinds of sequences, we have 3, the D2, the D3, and the A2. First, about the descending second sequence, the D2 sequence. Its more common name, you've probably heard this before, is the descending circle of fifths, or simply just the circle of fifths sequence. the D in D2 here refers to descending. The D2 sequence is our most important sequence in tonal music. No doubt about it, our most important sequence in tonal music. It's called the descending second sequence because of the stepwise descent of a second between the roots of every other chord. So in the handout here, I've given you a harmonic passage, 1, 4, 7, 3, 6, 2, 5, 1. And then the arrows point to the roots of every other chord. And when you just look at these identified chord roots, 1, 7, 6, 5, you see how we have a descent of a second. We have a D2 sequence. In the annotated copy of 1.02, handout 1.02, I've given you an example in the Burckhardt Anthology of a sequence. You may want to pause the video now and take a look at this example. As for a couple more items on the descending second sequence, the bass motion usually combines descending fifths and ascending fourths, or the other way around, ascending fourths and descending fifths. The sequence may be partial, yet it is often complete. Now, the D3 sequence, its nickname is the Pachelbel sequence. That's because it's the sequence used in the famous Pachelbel canon. The Pachelbel sequence, the D3 sequence, almost always results from root motion that falls by a fourth and then rises by a second. It's called the D3 sequence because of the descent of the interval of a third between the roots of every other chord. So, in the handout I've given you 1, 5, 6, 3, 4, and then 1. If you look at the arrows, you'll see that every other chord root moves down by a third. 1 to 6, the root motion falls by a third, descends by a third, D3. And then from 6 to 4, we have another root motion down a third, D3 descending a third. That's how we get the descending third sequence. An example of a D3 sequence I've given you in the annotated version of the handout. Again, you might want to stop the movie right now and take a look at it, give it a listen. Then there is the ascending second sequence, the A2 sequence. It's much less common than the descending circle of fifths, the D2 that we just spoke about. There are two main kinds, I guess you could say, of ascending second sequence. I don't get too hung up about this. The important thing is the big picture, that we see root motion of an ascending second between every other chord. So, for instance, one of the ascending second sequences has root motion that goes up a fifth and then down a fourth. So, example, we would have 1 to 5 to 2 to 6 to 3. If you take the root of every other chord, 1, 2, 3, you notice how we ascend by a second. The more common name of this A2 sequence is the ascending circle of fifths. The ascending circle of fifths, the A2 sequence, imparts a sense of momentum to the music. And I think the reason for this has to do with the frustration of normal harmonic tendencies. After all, 5 usually goes to 1, not to 2. Right? 5 usually falls by a fifth. It usually doesn't ascend by a fifth. There's a frustration here that gives life to the harmony, that gives drive, energy, life to the harmony, makes it somehow unsettled. Well, there's another A2 sequence that results from root motion that goes down a third and then up a fourth. So, for instance, 1 to 6, down a third, up a fourth to 2, down a third to 7, up a fourth to 3. You see, again, you take the root of every other chord root, and you find an ascent of a second. There's no common name for this one other than the A2 sequence. You may find this sequence used with first inversion triads. That's nothing really to worry about. I've given you, again, on the annotated copy of this handout, an example from the Burckhardt anthology of an A2 sequence. The big thing to grasp in it when you study this is that every other chord root moves up by a second. Every other chord root moves up by a second. As for the analysis of sequences, I invite you to use a bracket to show the extent of the sequential passage, then identify the kind of sequence, D2, D3, or A2. I won't ask you to specify the base motion or the use of inversion. It's just good enough for me if, again, if ideally you can spot a D2, an A2, a D3 sequence, perhaps with a little prompting. Show the letter names of the roots of the chords involved in the sequence. I'll ask that you don't use Roman numerals. We used Roman numerals in the handout here to illustrate these sequences, but I did that because Roman numerals are familiar to you in a way that perhaps chord roots aren't. The reason for not showing Roman numerals within a sequence is, again, that sequences can exist. Sequences do exist in their own little world where the rules of normal harmonic motion need not apply. So I think in order to show that we're within a sequence, that we're within sequence land, if you want, you might find it useful to avail yourself of a different means of analysis. As for showing the quality of these chords, I don't think it's necessary, again, within sequences to show the quality of the chords. I mean, should you be asked, you should be able to specify what the chord quality of each individual chord is, but I don't think it's really necessary. And again, the reason for this is that sequences operate in their own little world. What we're concerned with is a certain kind of root motion that's almost independent of quality. Well, we'll see about maybe trying to get a little practice with some sequences as we go along. The important thing, though, in general about sequences is to know that sequences entail the repetition of a pattern on a different pitch level, and that of our three sequences, the D2, the D3, and the A2 sequence, the D2 is the most important. So please take a little time and look at the examples in the Burckhardt anthology.